Stacy Griffith has been president of the Land Hermit Crab Owners Society and owner of the Crab Street Journal since 2008. She began keeping hermit crabs in 2003. After taking over Lycos and CSJ, she began reading scientific research studies to further educate herself on the biological needs of hermit crabs so that she could help improve care practices and educate others. Stacy hopes to change the mainstream mindset so that hermit crabs can thrive in captivity for decades instead of just surviving for a year or two. I'm proud to say she is also my cohort in the formation of the new nonprofit Hermit House, and she's also co-founder of CrabCon. Without Stacy's efforts and her years of dedication, none of us would be here today doing this. Please welcome my friend and favorite crazy crab lady, Stacy Griffith.
Greetings and welcome to my presentation today. I'm going to be talking about the dry setup method, a deep dive into substrate. And I am Stacy Griffith, the president of the Land Hermit Crab Owners Society and the owner of the Crab Street Journal. Today I would like to discuss why beginning with a dry substrate can establish a solid foundation for success in your crab habitat. I would like to clarify any misunderstandings regarding the utilization of this method. And before we start, I would like to address a comment that I often hear. This method doesn't work for everyone. With the right mindset, it actually works for everyone. Please note that the dry setup method is not designed to create an instantly perfect substrate right out of the box. The purpose is to establish a strong base for achieving success in the long run. When setting up a crab habitat, it's important to prioritize long-term stability over speed. Mitigating potential issues like flooding, bacterial blooms, and mold should be a key focus to ensure the safety and well-being of your crabs. During my presentation, I will be discussing the dry substrate method, including its history, advantages and disadvantages, and findings from a survey I conducted. I do want to express my gratitude to all of those who took time to complete the survey. So coming up will be the first section, the dry method, how we got here, then pros and cons, and finally the survey results. Let's begin with a simple exercise. What does sandcastle consistency mean to you? We have 4 jars of sand. Choose which jar is sandcastle consistency and type your answer in chat. I will be joining you in chat during the presentation, so I'll be able to see your responses. Have you ever played the game of telephone during your school days? It's the one where the teacher whispers a phrase into one student's ear, and then it gets passed on to the next student, and the next student, and the next student, until it reaches the very last student in the row or the class. And when the last student speaks it out loud, it's never the same as what the teacher originally said. This game is a classic example of how information gets altered as it passes through different people. The original meaning of sandcastle consistency, suggested by its creators, seems to have gotten lost in translation. It's possible that what you or others understand as sandcastle may differ from its original intentions. This can lead to oversaturated substrate from the beginning. Most respondents chose jar 4, with jar 3 the second more popular choice. I'll reveal the answer at the end of the presentation. Let's quickly go over the steps for starting your crab habitat build using dry substrate. Start by purchasing the driest play sand you can find. Allow it to dry out if needed. It should feel dry but not necessarily dusty. Mix 5 parts of dry sand to 1 part dry eco earth. Fill your crab habitat to the desired depth and allow a couple inches for settling. Install your water pools. Install your gauges. Install your lid. Turn on the heat pad. And then in a few days, perform a poke test on your substrate. If it passes the poke test, you're done. And as long as your heat and humidity are good, it's time to move the crabs in. If it fails the poke test and it's collapsing in because it's too dry, add a small amount of water to the substrate. Churn lightly, then close the lid. Recheck again in about 24 hours. Repeat if necessary. To check the consistency of your substrate, perform a poke test. Sometimes we call this the straw test as well. Using a straw, or if you can't find a straw, you can use your finger or a marker. A straw is nice because you can test to a deeper depth of the substrate because the straw is longer. So look for something similar in length if at all possible. Poke a hole in your substrate and then slowly remove the item. The substrate should just hold its shape. I mean, just barely hold its shape. It should be like almost crumbling in on itself, but not quite. It definitely should not be hard packed. Leave the opening there and wait about an hour and then get a flashlight and check down in the bottom of your hole. If you see water, your substrate is already far too wet and needs to be dried out. If the hole collapses immediately, your substrate is too dry. Check a few different places in the tank to verify that that really is the case everywhere and that you just didn't happen to pick a dry spot. And then if it's still too dry, that's when you're going to slowly add water to the tank. Please be careful and consistent when adding water. Begin with 1 cup of water poured along the front glass just to help it spread out faster. Sometimes I'll tell you to pour it in the corner, but that's typically if you have crabs under in a different situation, in a stabilized tank. But with an empty tank, we can just go ahead and pour it all along that front glass, and that will help it spread out faster. Then sort of lightly churn that wet sand and kind of mix it in with some of the nearby sand, but don't over churn or you're going to cause the moisture to evaporate. So we don't want to do that. If you live in a dry climate, you might need to add a significant amount of water, but be cautious while doing so. It takes a considerable amount of time to dry out sand once it becomes wet. So how did we get here? I have been keeping hermit crabs for 14 years prior to creating our Facebook group. In joining other groups, I quickly discovered that false bottoms were being pushed as a requirement due to the numerous instances of flooding, bacterial bloom, and mold that the members of those communities were reporting. I couldn't stop wondering how this was happening to begin with. I'd never encountered somebody with a flooded crab habitat, and bacteria and mold in the substrate were unheard of. I needed an answer, at least for myself if nothing else, and what I found was that crab habitats were being set up with sand and eco-earth that was far too wet, and then that was immediately creating a very high humidity, and they were being encouraged to maintain that high humidity, like I'm 90% plus humidity. Then those people most likely had also been encouraged to mix organic matter such as leaves into the substrate. And then these large filtered water pools had also become really popular. In other words, in my opinion, the flooding, bacterial blooms, and mold were largely self-inflicted. The instructions for setting up your crab habitat, initially created by the Land Hermit Crab Owners Society and the Crab Street Journal, may have been unintentionally modified or lost in translation, similar to the game of telephone that we were talking about. At CSJ, we highly recommend that hermit crab owners share our care guide links instead of recreating or memorizing and then repeating them. This is crucial for maintaining accuracy in our methods and avoiding errors or deviation from the methods that introduce new problems. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons of starting with a dry substrate. The pros. It's easier to add water to the substrate than it is to remove water from the substrate. This method works in all climates. By utilizing this technique, a healthy substrate is established, which can sustain its well-being for a longer duration. Translation: healthy sub long term. The cons: it takes longer to get the crab habitat stable enough for habitation, and drying out sand takes forever. Although the dry substrate method takes longer, it should not be a concern, as completing the task as quickly as possible should not be your main objective, in my opinion. When it comes to fish keeping, it's important to understand that introducing your fish into the aquarium on the first day is not recommended. It's crucial to allow the water to cycle and stabilize beforehand in order to prevent any potential harm or death to your fish. So think of your substrate as aquarium water and give it some time. If you're unable to find dry sand, it can be very time consuming to dry out several 100 pounds of sand. Now let's talk about some notes and frequently asked questions. Should I add all my decorations right away? Your water pool should be added right away. Remaining decor can be added at the beginning or left until the substrate is ready. That's really up to you. However, wood will absorb some of your moisture, and after adding it, you may experience a drop in humidity. Some people mitigate that by soaking their wood first or misting the wood itself once it's in the tank. How much water do I add and how often? Some of you aren't going to like this answer. I can't tell you. Given all the different tank sizes, local climate, household ambient heat and humidity, I can't give you hard numbers. All I can say is just go slowly. Start out with a cup of water first, and in 24 hours, see how far it spreads. After you've poured a few cups of water in there, you'll kind of get an idea of how far the moisture is spreading, and you'll have a better idea of how much water you're really going to need to get to that end result. What about drilled tanks? A drilled tank is a great option, in my opinion, but this has to be done prior to setting up the tank. And if you're not comfortable drilling glass at home, you're either going to have to take the tank someplace and have it drilled, or have somebody come to your house and do that for you. Then you'll have to purchase a drainage port or a bulkhead that doesn't create a trap hazard for your crabs and will also not get plugged with sand. Most of these drainage ports are being used with a drainage layer and cocoa fiber as the substrate and not sand. So the sand may plug it and may kind of defeat the purpose if it's not installed correctly. What about a drainage layer? So I did a test run on standard drainage layers. Using moss on top of the drainage material resulted in mold. And when I used just the drainage rock, the grow stone and hydro balls are what I used, they were dug up by my crabs, and within a year they were all on the surface of my substrate. So a drainage layer is not a viable solution for us. It does work with many other pets, but those pets are not diggers like hermit crabs are. Like frogs were one of the animals that I saw that were being housed with a drainage layer, but they were living on just cocoa fiber and then the drainage layer underneath it. So it worked in their environment, but it just doesn't work in ours. And the moss is a giant red flag, or should be to you, about burying organic matter into your substrate. That is a very popular practice in some groups, but when you bury organic matter down into an anaerobic environment, you're just asking for mold. There were no crabs in my the first tank that I had where this molded. I didn't have any crabs living in there. I set it up exactly to specifications. I put water pools in there. I did the heat pad. Everything was in it except the crabs, to completely recreate the actual environment we would be using that drainage layer in. And it molded. So I cannot recommend using organic matter as a drainage material, and using rocks or hydro balls is a effort in futility, because your crabs will just dig them all up. Being crabs, doing what they do. I do have a few notes that I just want to share. These are just sort of some FYI tidbits. Filtered pools and bubblers will increase your humidity. That's why we use them. But you have to be aware of how much your bubblers are splashing, because that is all going to be absorbed by your sand. And if you do poke tests periodically after your tank has been set up for a while, you may find that the sand around your pools is incredibly wet. I found that before I put some trays under my pools to help collect not only the splashing, but the amount of the water the crabs carry out on their own. And typically we tell you that maintaining your substrate is not necessary. Replacing it just for the sake of keeping it clean is not necessary. Churning is not necessary. Churning isn't a bad thing, but you absolutely should not be doing this when your crabs are underground, and you absolutely should not be digging up your crabs to do this. So hear me and hear me well. Do not dig up your crabs just to churn your substrate. However, if your crabs are all above ground, in the summer is a good time for that to happen, and everybody's above ground and accounted for, take them out and do some checking on your substrate. And if it is really wet around your pools but feeling kind of dry by the heat pad, or just in other spots, then you can go ahead and sort of really get in there and churn it around and mix some of that wetter stuff out and redistribute the moisture. That will also sort of fluff your sand back up, because you'll notice over time it starts to settle and kind of pack down. And if it's wet around the pools, it's really going to pack hard to where the crabs can't actually dig in or out of it. So I don't do that every year. In the past few years, I've had either to move and dig my crabs up, or I had an ant invasion and had to dig my crabs up. And that was just something that I had observed during those teardowns, that it hadn't reached a point where it was a problem yet. But had I not been tearing down my tank at that time for a required reason, it may have flooded or caused issues. So don't dig your crabs up for shits and giggles. Only do this if you have a legitimate concern that your sand is too wet. Like, are you guys hearing me about this? I know one of you out there is going to go, well, Stacy said to churn your sand all the time, and I have to dig my crabs out and churn the sand. That is not what Stacy is telling you. Don't make me put on my mom voice. Okay, let me get down off my soapbox. On to the next note. The cocoa fiber or eco-earth should be dry also. Dry. If you live in a very dry climate, Arizona for example, it would be fine to use the cocoa fiber just slightly damp. And that means you wet it like you normally would, get it all broke up and loose, and then spread it out and let it air dry to where it really is just like wring all of it out that you can with your hands, and then let it air dry, and so that it's just barely damp. If you buy the loose stuff in the bags, that's already very, very dry and already broken down, so you could mist that very lightly and then kind of just toss it around to distribute the moisture. Just don't get carried away. If you live in a dry climate, your sand will likely be so dry in the bag that it's dusty, and you'll need to add more water than most people, and that's okay. That's part of the process. Churning the sand by hand several times a day will speed up the process. That's helpful to know if you bought sand from inside the store and you thought it was dry, and then you poured it into the tank and realized that it's a little bit damper than it probably should be. Just leave it in the tank, and a few times a day just kind of go through and just, churn it over. The more you expose it to air, the faster it will dry out. If at all possible, buy bags of sand stored inside versus outside. Bags of sand that have been stored inside are more likely to have been wet and possibly moldy. The bags pictured here were inside the store, but they may have been stored outside before being placed on the sales floor. They may have been stored outside by the manufacturer, the distributor. They may have been sitting on a dock or a boat somewhere. You don't know what they went through before they got to the store. The bags here were inside, still for sale, and completely full of black mold, which is not safe for your hermit crabs or your kids or you. Some reminders. This is not a race to see how fast you can set up the crab-habitat. Take your time and do it right. Set yourself up for long-term success and not a quick fix. All right, let's look at some survey results. Have you experienced a flood in your crab-habitat? 91.3% of our respondents reported that no, they had not ever experienced a flood in their crab-habitat. And 8.8% said yes. And given that most of the survey takers are members of the Lycos community, I'm not surprised at these numbers. We have worked hard to educate folks about starting with their substrate dry and following this method, and clearly you guys are listening, and I think that that's a great thing. I'm really pleased by these numbers, to be honest. It can be challenging to establish a precise process for all of the potential variations that may impact your crab-habitat, just due to the numerous environmental variables involved. Things like your local climate, your indoor climate, and your climate control. How would you describe your local climate? The top categories for climate among our survey respondents: 57.5% live in a continental warm summer climate, 15% live in a humid subtropical climate, 7.5% live in a dry, arid climate. In a dry, arid climate, your sand is likely going to be so dry that it's dusty, and it's going to be necessary for you to add more water than someone who lives in a humid subtropical zone who can't find dry sand anywhere. And that's okay. It's part of the process. Let's do a quick survey in chat. In the summer, what do you set your home thermostat to? And then, what do you set the thermostat to in the winter? The climate inside the crab habitat can be greatly influenced by a variety of factors, including this one, which can significantly vary from one house to another, which you will probably see in the responses in chat. So you have to consider things like, what is your thermostat set to? How old is your home? Because older homes tend to be less energy efficient. So even though you run your thermostat on 75, maybe the house really only gets up to 73 where the crab tank is sitting. Those things all factor in. And then how humid is your house? Some people like a swamp cooler because they live in a dry climate and that adds extra humidity to their home. Or you may run humidifiers in your house for health reasons. And so most people, unless you live in a tropical climate, if you need air conditioning, your house isn't super humid because the air conditioning sucks all that humidity out of the air. Most of our respondents use central heating and cooling. The method used for climate control can also affect the environment inside the crab habitat, like the swamp cooler that I mentioned on the previous slide. For example, the cooler your home is, the more likely you will have condensation inside the crab tank. The cold air up against that warm glass creates condensation. So if you think about how much condensation you get on a cold drink when you're outside in the summer heat, it's the same effect that's happening on the glass of your crab habitat. And condensation can saturate your substrate and cause a flood. Now let's look at our jars of sand again. After watching this second video, which jar is sandcastle consistency? Type your answer in chat, and if you changed your answer, type that into chat also. Our survey respondents chose jar 4. The correct answer is jar 4, but the difference between 3 and 4 is subtle. Sandcastle does not mean wet. In our usage, sandcastle means just damp enough to hold its shape. You can see in the video that the sand isn't wet enough to stick to my hand, but it holds up perfectly to the poke test. This sand could actually be a touch drier and still pass the poke test. What about a false bottom? The use of false bottoms came about as a result of starting out with too wet substrate and maintaining too high humidity. While there is some value to using a false bottom, there are problems that can arise when it is not implemented correctly or maintained correctly. A drilled tank with a drainage port is a simpler solution in my opinion. These are just a few of the photos I collected while investigating all of these flooded tank posts that I was seeing in other communities. And it's common for mold and bacteria to grow both in the substrate and the false bottom when the substrate is oversaturated. Even when water is draining into the false bottom, these microorganisms can still thrive in the wet sand. It's important to frequently siphon out the false bottom to avoid mold. If you find mold in your false bottom, a full teardown and removal of the false bottom will be necessary to address the issue, and you will have to throw away all of your substrate and start fresh. Experienced adult keepers might choose to install a false bottom, but Land Hermit Crab Owners Society and Crab Street Journal care guidelines are intended to be such that a child can follow them with little to no adult intervention. Children are still the target market for hermit crabs, and care recommendations are intentionally kept simple to help younger keepers succeed. I want to thank you all for joining me today and listening to my presentation. I hope that I've clarified this method a little bit more for some of you. I hope that I've answered questions for some of you, and I hope that I have demonstrated the value of using this method when setting up your crab habitat for the first time. I hope you guys are having an amazing CrabCon. I'm so excited to be back this year. I'm so excited to be in Virginia with all of you who are here live at CrabCon, and I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you during my presentation as this played. And now we're going to shift over and we'll do some live Q&A.